In this our third session at the Tax Education Day for this year's Tax Research Network annual conference. We have a panel discussion developing ideas and thinking about the public education in tax. We have two panel members that are joining me as part of the panel to lead today's discussion off. Both of them will speak for 5 or 6 minutes or so as pre-recorded presentations before we break into a live discussion, which will pick up some of the themes that we have heard from both our two panelists, but also from our keynote speaker who presented to us in our first session of today's conference. Our first panelist today is Danel Lyons. Danel is a partner at Deloitte here in the United Kingdom, where he has a background particularly in indirect tax, but most recently has been leading the tax policy group for the UK firm. While many of you heard him speak on a whole range of topics, we've asked him today particularly to focus at some work that he led for Deloitte in 2018 entitled Tax Education Gap. Is it time to talk tax? That was a survey that the firm did with over 2,000 adults, asking them all kinds of questions about tax codes, tax rates, tax allowances, trying to gauge the level of tax education and tax knowledge amongst the average member of the UK population. If you've seen that report and read it, as I suspect many of you have, you will have been surprised and shocked possibly by what low levels of tax education that report was able to highlight. It produced an average score of 10.6 out of a maximum of 30 for the population. And perhaps particularly worrying, while 50% of the population scored less than 10 out of 30, some of the lowest scores were in the 18 to 24-year-old category, where they scored only 6.4 out of 30 on average. So firstly, Danel will introduce that report to us and talk a little bit about why he thinks that tax education for the public is critical. Our second panelist today is Dr. Phyllis Alexander. Phyllis works as a principal academic in accounting and taxation at Bournemouth University. Phyllis will be well known also to many of you, I'm sure, because she's a regular attender at our events and a member of the steering group of the Tax Research Network. Phyllis also presented some work on tax education to us last year, and it's on the basis of that work that we've asked us to speak to us today as part of this panel. Her work, as you may recall, if you heard that, was on tax literacy amongst students. But she's been developing some of that work subsequently and wants to talk to us today, particularly around the possibility of developing a tax education week for the United Kingdom. So without further ado, I'll hand over firstly to Danel for his presentation and then to Phyllis for hers. And following that, we'll break into a live session to be able to debate some of these issues that both Danel and Phyllis have raised, but also any follow-up from the issues that James raised in his presentation, his keynote presentation earlier. So over to you, Danel. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Danel Lyons. I'm Head of Tax Policy at Deloitte. I'm also Chair of Exams at the Chartered Institute of Taxation. I'd like to talk about tax knowledge. I think there's a long debate going on in the world of tax about the complexity of the UK's tax legislation, particularly about the scale of the tax legislation. We all look at our bookshelves when we get our new tax legislation every year, or at least until it all went sort of online, and we sort of measure it with a tape measure and say there's an awful lot more legislation than was last year, certainly a lot more than the beginning of my tax career 30 years ago. Isn't that a terrible thing? It's all very complicated. But we're looking at it purely through the lens of a tax expert, a tax practitioner, somebody, a tax academic or an accountant or a solicitor who uses the tax legislation all the time, who's constantly looking at HMRC's manuals, who's reading tax cases, etc. And, you know, we're not average people by any means. In fact, lots of people would think that description of our lives is a pretty strange, pretty weird. What we should be focusing on, I think, is the experience that the normal person has of tax, how the tax system impacts on their life. And, you know, frequently policy makers will talk about various complicated formulas to raise new revenue or maybe change behaviour depending on the nature of the tax, but they don't really fully appreciate the tax knowledge of the great British public, to use that hackneyed phrase. And we thought it'd be interesting at Deloitte. We thought it'd be interesting to try and measure that, to try and get some idea of how a normal person without a background in tax law or accounting or academia actually views the tax system and how much they know about it. Because it's all well and good having complicated taxes, but if people don't understand them, do they really achieve their policy objectives? So in May last year, we worked with YouGov and we did a survey of 2,119 people. I'm not quite sure why it was that, not very round number, but that's what it was. And we made sure that we had a cross-section of the population from all the different countries within the UK. It allowed for age, gender, region, occupation, even political affiliation. So hopefully it was a balanced cross-section of UK adults. We didn't ask any children. What did we find out? Well, we focused exclusively on personal tax. We thought it would be unreasonable to ask them about transfer pricing or landfill tax. Let's talk about personal tax, the tax that most of those people will pay in one way or another. So we had exclusive focus on personal tax and we had a maximum score of 30. And we spent ages trying to make sure the questions were reasonable, trying to make sure that a normal person would have some expectation of getting them right. We didn't want to make them too esoteric. And we had this process where we filtered out questions we thought that were a bit too academic or technical. And we ended up with 30 reasonable questions. And we really thought, and maybe we're prejudging things a little bit, we really thought that people wouldn't do terribly well. But we were surprised by how badly people did. Without going into the details, and I can share all this stuff with you at a later stage, the average score was just over 10 out of 30. And the higher scores were only in the high teens. We were actually staggered by that. And one of the things that the survey did, which was a good idea, was, before we started, we asked people to self-rate their tax knowledge. And most people thought their tax knowledge was pretty poor. And most people were absolutely right. So at least they weren't deluded. They knew they didn't know very much about tax, and as the survey showed, they didn't know very much about tax. But oddly, when we asked them the question, do you think it's important, virtually a very large majority of people said, yes, we think tax education is very important, and people in the UK don't know enough about it. They were certainly in favour of there being more tax education in the UK. So what do we get from this? Well, very interesting. And once again, people might think this is obvious, that the two things that drove increased tax knowledge, and I should stress that increased doesn't necessarily mean good, but people who are getting scores in the mid to high teens rather than scores of less than 10, age was a big factor. The longer you've been around, the more experience you'd had of the tax system, and therefore the better your score was. And obviously education, if you've been through higher education, you were more likely to get a higher score, and people who were self-employed and had been engaged with self-assessment had a better idea of the personal tax system. So all those things are unsurprising. We had two examples of a sort of 20-year-old in a relatively low-paid job whose average tax score will be very low, and then a 65-year-old who'd been self-employed and was university educated, etc. He or she would have a higher score. So that's not surprising. The amount of engagement, amount of experience you have, you're likely to get a higher score. A bit like doing a general knowledge quiz in the pub or something. The longer you've been around, the more you know. But one thing that was really interesting, and one final point I'm going to make here, is that the better your score in the survey was, the better your tax knowledge was, the more likely you were to think that the UK tax system was fair, and the more likely you were to be prepared to pay more tax. So there seems to be some thinking here. It'd be interesting to develop this further around knowledge and perceptions of fairness. So it's clear that the people who really didn't understand the tax system at all were starting from a position generally that it was terribly unfair. The more understanding you had of the system, the more likely you were to think it was fair. And other academic research, and I'm sure Phyllis and Andy will have much more to say on this than me, would imply that the fairer you think the system is, the more likely you are to comply with it, comply with the rules, the more likely you are to be a compliant taxpayer. So there must be a message for the revenue there as well. So there are all sorts of things pointing towards the suggestion that we started off with at the beginning of this research, that more tax education would be a good thing. How we deliver that is a much bigger question. I'm afraid I don't have all the answers. Thank you for listening to me.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Alexander. I'm from Bournemouth University, and I specialize in tax research and tax education. I recently led a project commissioned by the CIOT, the Chartered Institute of Tax, which was to investigate the impact of tax literacy and work experience on tax morale in young people. Now, this research was of mixed methodologies, and the first phase was survey-based, and it involved students halfway through their undergraduate degrees in 2 universities in the UK. And then 18 months later, we had the opportunity to involve students from one of these universities again in focus groups to explore more deeply the impact of their placement year work experience on their individual tax morale. Now, coincidentally, and completely unprompted by the facilitator of these focus groups, the participating students unanimously agreed that they would have appreciated some basic tax tuition in school. Surprisingly, not one of them had had a day's lesson on basic income taxation before coming to university. This message was resonating in my consciousness when I attended a Deloitte event in which Daniel Lyons showcased his research into tax awareness. And I was delighted with the recommendation that we had made to the CIOT in our report, that it was being echoed through the key panelists in the audience at this Deloitte event. It really was quite evident that we were all on the same page. There needs to be more of an effort to educate our young people in the practical matters of tax before they enter the workplace. Now, motivated by our students' desires and further encouraged by the discussions at the Deloitte event, Andy Lymer, one of my co-authors, Danel and myself, we organized a roundtable this past January where we brought together representatives from government, professional bodies, practitioners, academics, and student unions. And the energy and the enthusiasm to push this agenda forward and to make a real difference was palpable. One of the ideas that was floated was to harness this mutual ambition to raise awareness and improve knowledge, and to use our extended networks to design and deliver a nationwide tax week. Now, we're not alone in our desire to raise tax awareness and to recognize the importance of building tax morale early on. The OECD published a report in 2015, Building Tax Culture, Compliance and Citizenship, which shared efforts of taxpayer education in developing countries around the world. Now, I believe we have a lot to learn on how better to organize and package and deliver basic tax tuition to our young people. HMRC have fantastic short videos on the basics of taxation, and these have accompanying teachers' packs for primary and school teachers. The CIOT web-based resources are excellent too. But pushing these resources and this information through the school system to effectively signpost to reliable, up-to-date, and user-friendly information, this is an issue that we have yet to resolve. But if practitioners and academics banded together for a festival of learning during a dedicated week each year, we could offer age and circumstance-specific talks and workshops on perhaps the understanding of the tax code, self-assessment reporting for the self-employed, and how about the tax implications of retirement and, yes, death and taxes, a showstopper. The workshops could be held in schools, community centers, and at the local universities. They would be opportunities to raise awareness of the issues before they become problems, and to signpost to further online free and good information. Or for more complex cases, they might serve as a professional networking opportunity. Now, we are all in this together, and the impact of COVID-19 just reemphasizes how important the sustainability of the fiscal state really is. Tax education needs to be offered early in schools and then continuously reinforced and enhanced throughout life as circumstances change. I really do appreciate your time and interest in this important matter. Please say yes to a UK Tax Week by liking this recording. Thank you.